was buried.
This vintage map displays the Alsace-Lorraine region, focusing on the dense, walled city of Strasbourg. In the midsummer of 1518, a heavy, oppressive heat settled over its streets. On a completely ordinary July morning, a local woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her home. Without a word, her body began locking and jerking into motion, falling into a rhythmic, involuntary dance. To the neighbors watching from their windows, the sight was baffling. There was no music playing in the square. The only sound was the repetitive scraping of her shoes against the dry stone. No one intervened. Onlookers assumed it was a fleeting moment of oddity. There was absolutely no indication that her solitary movements were the spark of a massive municipal crisis. The true nature of her condition became apparent when the sun went down. As night fell, Frau Troffea did not stop. Even as her muscles failed from exhaustion, she continued to move. The physical toll was brutal. Her feet blistered and bled through her thin leather shoes. Yet, witnesses noted her facial expression showed zero joy, only wide-eyed, undeniable terror. The anomaly jumped. A neighbor stepped into the street and began to mirror her erratic steps. Within a few days, over 36 people had succumbed to the exact same physical compulsion. By the end of the week, this shared rhythm had taken hold of the neighborhood. Dozens of citizens were now visible in the streets, all driven by a singular physical impulse they could not break. By August, the crisis had escalated beyond control. This engraving illustrates the sheer scale, with hundreds writhing through public squares. The relentless movement was destroying their bodies. Look closely at the foreground figures. They are completely depleted, physically propping one another up to keep moving. Desperate to restore order, the local council consulted their physicians.
The prevailing medical hypothesis blamed the affliction on overheated blood. Their prescription was to have the victims dance even more to burn the fever off. The authorities subsidized the panic. This illustration shows their surreal response, hiring musicians to relentlessly play for the crowds. The piper's cheerful demeanor contrasts entirely with the agonized victims. Pushed past human limits, dancers began dropping dead in the streets. By attempting to cure the populace with stages and music, the authorities had inadvertently exacerbated the crisis, turning a bizarre psychological break into a lethal disaster. The mechanical output of these victims stretches the limits of human endurance. To explain how bodies could survive days of constant motion, modern clinical researchers have had to re-examine these centuries-old accounts to find a biological explanation for such a persistent anomaly. A prominent theory is ergotism. This photograph displays schism, a toxic fungus on rye. Consuming it floods the nervous system, triggering violent spasms and hallucinations. But the ergot theory faces an anatomical hurdle. This diagram shows ergot violently constricting a vein, drastically cutting off blood flow. Sustaining intense movement requires constant oxygenated blood. These restricted vessels would trigger oxygen starvation, forcing muscles to cramp and cease movement within hours. While tainted bread can explain twitching limbs and madness, it cannot provide the biological fuel necessary to dance aggressively for an entire week. If the trigger wasn't chemical, researchers have looked toward the mind. Epidemiologists categorize events like this under mass psychogenic illness, where extreme collective psychological distress manifests as a contagious physical symptom. In 1518, Strasbourg was under immense pressure. The lower classes endured failed harvests, widespread starvation, and visible diseases like leprosy and syphilis. Piled onto this physical misery was a specific cultural terror. Parishioners held a deep fear of Saint Vitus, a religious martyr believed to punish sinners by cursing them with an uncontrollable urge to dance. This diagram outlines a potential breaking point. When a population is battered by starvation and terror, the collective psychological threshold can fail. The conscious mind dissociates to escape the reality, leaving the body running on an involuntary repetitive loop. Under this framework, the victims in the streets were not suffering from a poisoned food supply. Their collective minds had suffered a catastrophic malfunction in an attempt to outrun their environment. As the summer faded into autumn,
the compulsion eventually burned itself out. The survivors stopped moving, and the streets fell quiet, leaving the surviving population deeply traumatized. Mass psychogenic illness provides a framework for how extreme stress affects a group. Yet, the 1518 event remains an outlier that challenges a simple explanation. Modern outbreaks of mass hysteria typically involve hyperventilation, fainting, or minor tremors. The sheer volume of victims in Strasbourg, the duration of their endurance, and the specific rhythmic nature of their movements remain unique in the historical record. We have mapped the human genome and charted the pathways of the brain, yet the events in Strasbourg suggest that human physiology and group psychology hold capabilities we still cannot fully measure. It leaves us with the central question: how could an entire town suddenly begin to dance and find themselves unable to stop?